Welcome to the Daily Wrap-Up, a concise show dedicated to bringing you the most relevant independent news as we see it from the last 24 hours. So I was planning on taking today off. As many of you know, I've been fighting something off, and I was planning on taking the day off, save for a major event. And indeed, that's what we have today with what's going on in Syria. Now, I wanted to make sure and point out the fact that even though I'm feeling under the weather, it's important for you guys to know that I'm here because of you. That's what I'm here for. So I'm here for you people. I would not be here without your grace. The fact that you guys fund what I'm doing is the reason that I'm here able to do this. So despite the fact that I'm feeling under the weather, I'm still here because this is important enough to bring you the news. So I want you to recognize that this is all of us. It's not just me. You guys are the last American vagabond. So I am proud to be here, even on days when I'm not feeling up to it, to bring you what I find to be the most important, to support this community. That's how much you all mean to me. So I want to first off start with the point that somebody brought to my attention yesterday, politely, and then it kind of deleted their comment. It turns out that what I was deferring to yesterday in regard to Spain and the deal with Saudi Arabia, turns out that they had essentially gone back on what they said and have in fact gone through with the deal. And the point I want to make here with this, I don't pay as much attention. I don't keep as close an eye on the mainstream media as I do on a lot of independent media. And that's my failing in this regard. And I missed this in the last couple of days. It was only a few days in which I did not see this. But this is a perfect example of why we need to read everything, keep our eyes on everything, including the mainstream media, and apply that same criticism and skepticism to everything, mainstream media and independent media alike, because there's information all over the place. And this story, in fact, did not come across me in all of the independent sources that I frequent. So it slipped by me. I would have seen it eventually, but yesterday I snafu'd there and I talked about it as if it was still Spain pulling back from the deal. And in fact, they had turned around on it. The point being, it's important for us to keep our eyes open to all information and be skeptical of all information. Of course, more so with the mainstream media, with what we know about them. But this is a perfect example of why we need to keep our eyes open to everything, so we don't shut ourselves down to information that's equally important. So I appreciate any of you that said this and spoke out about it. It's important that we do know the truth in this. But of course, the other story about the white helmets, which I'm touching on again today as follow-up, is just as important. And the simple fact that Spain did that, even though they went back on it, is still important. Ultimately, the story comes down to the fact that they were pressured by people in their administration to not renege on the deal. They said, well, you did it. You can't go back on what you said. So they went through with it anyway. Point being, they did not want to do it because of the reasons they stated, because those bombs could be used to kill children. The fact remains. Nonetheless, I wanted to make sure you got the full story. So that's important for you to see. So back onto the first story of the day, the most important news happening today that I'm not really seeing covered anywhere save for a few places. And this is indeed a massive event worthy of discussing today, regardless. This one entitled from Zero Hedge, Massive Sustained Attack on Syria. Russian S-400, which is very relevant, defenses possibly active in huge escalation. Indeed, a very huge escalation. I've seen it here, and I've seen it reported on South Front so far today. This entitled, Airstrikes on Government Facilities Reported in Latakia, Tartus, Homs, and Hama, actually, provinces. Russia allegedly employs own air defenses. I'm sure there are other people covering this so far. I've yet to see it anywhere else. Very, very big development in this story. So another attack, another keyword on Syria has occurred tonight. It is nighttime for them on multiple locations in what is, in fact, the largest sustained series of what are believed to be Israeli or possibly U.S. airstrikes in months. But hugely significant is that early reports suggest Russia's S-400 missile defense system engaged the inbound rockets. On Monday night, Syrian state-run Sana confirmed multiple missiles fired, quote, from the sea into Latakia city. And in an aggression from unknown source, which state media says involved successful intercepts by Syrian missile defense. British Syrian journalist Danny Mackay, currently reporting on the ground, says the attack, quote, lasted for a total of 1 hour and a half, and missiles soared over 4 cities, including Latakia, Tartus, Homs, and Hama, with rockets and explosions lighting up the sky, especially over the coastal towns. Now we have a couple of images here to check out for the, to make sure you guys, in case people might think this is in fact not actually happening, we have actual footage of this taking place. Very, very obvious what's going on there. Reacting, fighting back, and indeed we have images of, as well, of the actual, apparently of a plane being shot down. Or that's reports. We're getting mixed reports on what that actually is. It's a very important thing to recognize that this is even happening. So, though it appears, after everything we've seen, that this is another Israeli strike, as it comes only 2 days later from another near attack on Damascus, or near Damascus, which we reported on then, which they still basically claim to not know anything about, even though it's been verified. Now, the details are still ultimately unknown, and some observers are speculating it could be an American attack, given that at least some of the missiles were fired from the sea. The initial major strike on Latakia, located on the Syrian coast, reportedly targeted a Syrian scientific research center facility. And newly published video and images from Syrian sources show the massive fireballs lighting up the sky, which we just showed you. But significantly, the location of the strike is in the vicinity of Russia's, I think it's pronounced Hamaim Air Base, and there are early unconfirmed reports that Russia engaged the inbound assault via its advanced S-400 system. According to the Middle East Institute's Charles Lister, quote, reports suggest Russia air defenses in Hamaim participated in attempting to repel tonight's strikes in Latakia. He continued, if that's true, that would be significant development. Some reports also say strikes came from the sea, leading to accusations of U.S. naval cruise missile attacks. Now, the reason the S-400 are so relevant, there's a lot of information around this discussion. We understand that that was originally going to be something that the Russians were going to give to Syria, and there was all this discussion of them talking with Israel and then pulling back that deal, even though they claimed to have video of them being shipped over in the first place. And now clearly we can see that it seems to me, if I'm based on all the information, that the whole deal with Israel and it was a move by Putin. Clearly, these are still there. Likely, they're in Russian areas, but if they're still being used to defend Syrian areas, that it defeats the purpose of claiming that they never got them to defend themselves. So it's a relevant discussion. Of course, it's in the area of Russia, so it's a Russian base, so they're going to defend themselves. But the fact that they're willing to shoot these down is a huge development. Of course, also bringing Russia into the fray here directly. Very big development here. Now, unconfirmed local eyewitness accounts say that 2 hostile aircraft were shot down during the lengthy assault, which we showed you supposedly of one footage of that. Now, in the most recent up-to-date development of the story, as of right before I started, the Pentagon has formally denied that tonight's massive sustained attack on Syria had any U.S. involvement, which shouldn't carry really any water because they've been caught in a lie saying exactly that in the past. Regardless, the story goes, they deny it thus far. U.S.-founded VOA News reports a Pentagon spokesman issued the following statement, quote, I can unequivocally say this is not us, said Navy Commander Sean Robinson. Now, you could even take that as saying this is not the Navy, or there's ways they are always getting around this stuff. But the point being, Syria has been attacked. Russia has been directly attacked in Syria. This is a very big deal, with everything coming up with the false flag chemical attack, all of the rhetoric from the United States, all of the United States Navy ships right on their coastline. This is a very, very big development. And of course, even if it was only Israel, which we know they've just, with impunity, attacked Syria for no cause, even directly Damascus in the last attack, even if it was them, we know that the United States was privy to this information. There's no way around that. They are working together. That's like saying that the Saudis attacking somebody in Yemen, which we'll get to in a moment, is completely outside of the United States' control and they have no idea it's happening. That's a blatant lie. So the fact that anybody attacked them, it's most likely Israel and the United States, and either way, they're aware of what's happening. So this is a massive development, and I'm sure more will come out. But as of right now, of course, all of the mainstream news that's on the, New York Times, every fact, every time, nothing. And of course, nothing will be said until they get the go-ahead from their control masters, telling them what they can say and how this is supposed to be delivered. Always remember where you get this information first, as clearly as always, the independent media gets called fake news for breaking the story before the mainstream media, and then when they come out with the same information, people just pretend it never happened. Very important to understand this is a huge development, and how Russia chooses to respond to this, how Syria chooses to respond to this, will say a lot and could greatly increase or decrease how this goes forward. But we'll have to wait and see. And of course, we will be here to report it to you the moment that we find out. Moving on to the next story, and in relation, as we were just talking about, more coming from Hodeidah, United States, horrible things from the United States allies, specifically Saudi Arabia, and more about Israel as well. But this one about Saudi Arabia in Hodeidah coming from antiwar.com. At least 32 killed around Yemen's Hodeidah in fighting Saudi airstrikes. As I understand it, one of our Discord group, Weta Coalition, just got an article published on anti-war. So fantastic for him. You should read his work as well. I'm sure you'll find it on this website. But anti-war is definitely worth following. They're a site that is really on the cusp of this information as it comes out. And this is nothing new. This is sad to realize this is continuing. Of course, as people continue to point out, in addition to the fact that horrible things are happening, it is clearly being overshadowed by the discussion of Syria. As this is clearly, even more than Syria, the worst thing happening in the world right now. As civilians are being just slaughtered, open-handed slaughtered by the Saudi government directly with the backing of the United States. And no one's talking about it. So hospitals in and around the Yemeni aid port of Hodeidah have reported 32 people were killed and 14 wounded just on Sunday in the course of multiple Saudi airstrikes. The slain were all labeled rebels, of course, by pro-Saudi military sources, which is really unsurprising. At least 4 of the slain were killed in an airstrike against a local radio station, which I'll touch on more in a moment, and indications are these were just employees of the station, not combatants. But that shouldn't be surprising at all, understanding that that's literally, like I pointed out in the last few shows, what the United States does and has done in Iraq, in Syria, admittedly. Just blandly saying everyone in this area that we're about to strike is all combatants because we're about to strike there. Like, confirming their own logic by their logic to begin with. Because we're about to attack, anyone there is a combatant. So anyone that dies is not a civilian. That's literally how they do their logic on the ground. And Saudis, regardless, have actively lied about the numbers they put out anyway. But could they be combatants? Of course. But the reality is, knowing their history, it's more than likely they're civilians, and that's all the information we're seeing coming from the ground. These are, in fact, civilians, from people like Hussein al-Bukaidi on the ground. These are actual civilians that are being murdered, which is nothing new for this situation. Now, since the UN-backed peace talks in Geneva failed a week ago, intentionally, willfully failed, the Saudis forbade the Houthis from even coming and did everything they could to stop them from coming, even threatened them. And that's why it failed, of course. Saudi-backed forces have been escalating strikes against Hodeidah horrendously. And which perfectly takes us to our next article, coming from Mint Press News, entitled, "After Peace Talks Fail, Saudi Coalition Revert to Scorched Earth Campaign Against Civilians in Yemen." So not long after the UN-brokered peace talks between Yemen and the Saudi coalition in Geneva were brought down, failed last week, the Saudi-led coalition renewed its offensive, of course, to capture Yemen's strategic port of Hodeidah, which we've talked about is the entire point of all of this. The strategic point of Hodeidah. Whether you're talking about connections with the One Belt, One Road scenario with China, which I've heard that there is a connection there, or as I see it, more importantly, simply the concept of the threat of shutting down the Strait of Hormuz and needing the port for many things if that indeed happens as they continue to threaten Iran. Regardless, it is a massively important geostrategic point, and that's what they're after. The attacks targeted internally displaced persons, people already displaced, fleeing the danger, targeting these people. They targeted vital facilities, civilian infrastructure, continuing a scorched earth campaign that's left scores of dead civilians in its wake. Recognizably by the UN, by international aid, by everybody except the United States, Israel, and Saudi Arabia. But seeing as how they have just unfettered control of any real control and enforcement mechanism, and as they've actively denied anything the ICC has to say, it doesn't seem to matter. They just continue to kill people and say, oh, well, they're trying not to, so So be it. Look the other way. At least 10 civilians, including women and children, were killed and dozens injured by Saudi-led coalition airstrikes in Hodeidah and Sadr on Friday. Just 2 days prior, coalition aircraft bombed Hodeidah's Kilo 16 district, killing 15 civilians and injuring dozens more, most of whom were hit when they were forced to flee down the only road that links Sana'a and Hodeidah, and they were bombed as they were fleeing. The deadly attacks come after U.S. Secretary of State Mike Pompeo openly defended the Saudi coalition following international pressure after the coalition targeted a school bus full of children. Of course, the only one that's gotten any real recognition, despite it being only one of 3 buses full of women and children that were targeted in a very short period of time. Not to mention all the many other funerals and weddings and things we've talked about on this show. But of course, after this one that some famous person makes a cartoon out of and everybody starts talking about it, they were forced into talking about it. As I continue to point out that is the pressure that we are able to put on them if we get enough of the ball moving, ball rolling. We need to continue to push this issue. But the point being, that's the only one they've chosen to talk about. And Mike Pompeo just simply said, oh, well, we looked into it and they're trying, so they're good. That, to paraphrase, that's basically what it boils down to. In another fresh attack on the U.S.-backed coalition, 10 civilians, including women and children, were killed when Saudi airstrikes targeted their family home in the village of Hawara in the Ghanaya district on Monday, if I'm pronouncing those correctly. 3 journalists and a guard were killed when Saudi airstrikes targeted the radio station we just talked about on Sunday. Now, understanding these are other reports claiming these are, in fact, 3 journalists that got killed in this radio station. Not combatants as they're making them out to be. And 2 of the people that were killed were, in addition, were severely injured after a fishing boat off the island of Asabawa was targeted on Saturday. Another civilian fishing vessel. Understand the point being to stop every possible means of feeding themselves that they can. That's why these people are starving. Because this is, like they said, a scorched earth campaign. This is not about fighting the Houthi rebels. This is U.S.-backed scorched earth campaign to affect the entire population. That's why we're talking about potentially 18 million people starving to death by the end of the year. By all accounts. Think about that. Now, to make matters worse, over 1,250 days of near constant airstrikes by the Saudi-led coalition have reduced Yemen's hospitals and clinics to rubble and short-circuited the electricity service, while the ruinous blockade, which we've talked about, U.S.-backed, has depleted the country's supply of food and life-saving medicine to almost nothing. Now, I know these things can be hard to look at, but the reality here is this is what your government is facilitating in Yemen. Children starving to death under the guise of spreading democracy, fighting for their allies. There is no logical reason for children to be starving to death, mass starvation because of this blockade. No logical reason. Even the reasons they give do not justify literally starving to death an entire nation, which is literally, no play on the word, what we are currently looking at, what your tax dollars are going towards. The United Nations said on Saturday that the situation of children in Yemen is in fact getting worse, not better, which, as we pointed out on the show regularly. Globally, Yemen ranks first in the number of children in need of humanitarian aid. Over 11 million children, 80% of the country's children, are in desperate need of assistance right this moment. Social services are barely functioning as the country is on the verge of ultimate collapse, entirely due to U.S.-backed Saudi efforts. The U.S.-backed military campaign has not only affected children, civilians across Yemen have suffered immensely from the campaign, which has left thousands of civilians dead, destroyed the country's infrastructure, and created the conditions for literally, as we pointed out, the worst humanitarian crisis in the world, in addition to the world's worst cholera epidemic. This is what's happening there, funded by your tax dollars, carried out by the U.S. government, willfully acknowledging all these things we talk about every day. Mattis, Pompeo, they know about this stuff, and yet they still stand there and look you right in the eye and tell you that, no, well, they're trying not to kill people, so I guess that's okay. And then turn around with a straight face and point the finger at other countries. This needs to be talked about. This is very important, and I will continue to talk about this as I did the last time until we force another story into their consciousness. The average people still blinded by the mainstream propaganda. Moving on to the next story coming from Mint Press News as well. A follow-up to a story we did yesterday. This is important as well. There's a couple of additions to this. Netherlands cut funding to white helmets over likely links to terrorism. Clear, obvious, proven, verifiable links to terrorism. It's a nice title. But the point being that this is a big deal. And of course, in relation to the Spain story in Saudi Arabia, the reality here is that the Netherlands are in fact doing this. They're cutting their funding to white helmets because of the information we're about to talk about, and it's important. Now, amid continued concerns that the white helmets are currently staging a false flag chemical weapons attack in Idlib, in Syria, the Netherlands has decided to halt funding for the controversial group due to the, quote, inadequate supervision of the White Helmets members on the ground and the group's likely links to al-Qaeda-affiliated terrorist organizations. That's where the likely comes from. Obviously, talking about politics. They don't want to just come out and say, you guys are funding terrorism. They have to throw in the likely there so they can save face. But the reality is, because obviously that makes it seem like they were currently and have been funding terrorism. So likely funding al-Qaeda, despite very clear, obvious connections. The decision was made after the Dutch Minister of Foreign Affairs, Stef Blok, and the Minister for Foreign Trade and Development Coordination, Sigrid Kaag, received a damning report from the Foreign Affairs Ministry Directorate for International Research and Policy Evaluation. The report slammed the Netherlands' supervision of aid projects in opposition opposition territory in Syria as extremely inadequate. Again, a very, very nice way to put that, but you get the point across. The report singled out the White Helmets specifically, stating that the supervision of the White Helmet members within Syria was well below acceptable standards, and further stated that the funding given to this group by the Dutch government had likely fallen into the hands of extremist groups, such as Hayat Tahrir al-Sham and Idlib. The literal group we're talking about that's currently in Idlib that the United States continues to pretend are just rebels. They're just rebels fighting for us. No big deal. They're al-Qaeda terrorists. And the Dutch government is now very clearly acknowledging that. Like I said the other day, there's only so many things people can just dismiss out of hand and say, oh, that's fake news. Oh, that's something that's not true. This is an entire nation openly saying that the White Helmets are funding terrorism or facilitating it at the very least. In total, the Netherlands has funded the White Helmets to the tune of $14.5 million since 2016. Just some local Syrian defense group, $14.5 million just from the Dutch government. Another group criticized in the report is the Mayday Rescue, a White Helmets-linked NGO directed by, guess who, former UK military intelligence officer turned mercenary, James Lemaizière. However you want to pronounce that French name. The very man who, in fact, founded the White Helmets in Turkey in 2013, which is something that even the mainstream media pretended was fake news until it was actually confirmed, and now that's just common knowledge. Yet another thing that turns out to be, oh, yes, guess what? The story that's been reported on for years by the independent media that was called fake news is now common knowledge. Much of the White Helmets' finances, which amounted to over $123 million between 2014 and 2016, have been funneled to the group's operatives through Mayday Rescue, through this man's cover operation. Though the U.S. company, the U.S. company Chemonics, I believe is how you pronounce it, also partially assumed this role in the beginning of 2016. So now we have a U.S. company and we have a U.K. intelligence officer company funneling this money to the White Helmets, over $123 million to just a local civil defense fund. Think that is a absurd amount of money in regard to what's going on the ground in Syria. Now, furthermore, the report noted that the White Helmets are active in areas where unacceptable terrorist-linked armed factions are in control. Again, in control. Again, pointing out that the Netherlands are now saying, talking about Idlib, where their terrorist groups are in control, directly countering all of the narrative from the Western media. That is huge. Openly saying that this is a terrorist-held area. Of course, just like we pointed out, the State Department said less than a year ago. But the point is CNN, all these groups are openly saying that's not true. And here's an entire government saying, in fact, it is true, and we're pulling back our money. Very big deal. This is now making contact between the White Helmets and the administrators who work with these terrorists is inevitable, is what they're saying. And the point is that they're choosing to not fund these groups anymore because of the clear connections that we've been screaming about for a very long time. Now, as Whitney Webb rightfully points out in her article, while the new report may make these concerns seem like sudden revelations, the White Helmet's ties to terrorist groups in Syria have been noted for years by the independent media, as well as by the governments of both Syria and Russia. You don't say. In addition, many reporters have revealed evidence that the White Helmets are far from the humanitarian do-gooders they claim to be, or they're made out to be by mainstream media. Their role, or given their tendency to doctor and search and rescue footage, their role in executing civilians and their use of children, both dead and alive, as props for producing pro-intervention propaganda. And as we continue to point out, they pleaded with the French and U.S. governments to please send us to Idlib as they were being chased out of Syria. All of this aligns to a very clear picture. There are terrorists in Idlib that the United States government is currently protecting. Very clearly. And now even the Dutch government is saying, we want no part of this. We do not want to help fund these groups anymore. They're terrorists. Pretty profound. Moving on to the next story as well, coming from Mint Press News. The final story of the day. This is an important one as well. Always touching on the U.S. allies. Now understand, this seems to be a theme lately of all the things that I'm talking about. But to me, again, these are the most important things going on in the world today, especially in regard to the fact that the United States is a key role in all of this stuff, at the very least, by allowing it to continue. Now, I understand that even though people may want to hear more about some local topics, which I understand, I pick out and choose every day what I think are the most important topics in the world for you to recognize as it relates to Americans. That's where we're broadcasting from, but in the world. And right now, these are the worst humanitarian crises going on in the world. This one, of course, in Palestine, the fake state of Israel, occupied Palestine. This article entitled, Illegal Jewish Settlements Surge by 187% as Israel eyes formal annexation of occupied Palestine. It's just, and understand that this directly ties to the overzealous, just rabid pro-Israel stance of the Trump administration. So new data released by Israel's Central Bureau of Statistics has revealed that the construction of illegal Jewish-only settlements sounds very democratic. Jewish-only settlements. That's just, if you heard that in any other way, in any other place in the world, that's called racism. So it's revealed that the construction of illegal Jewish-only settlements in the Palestinian West Bank surged in the second quarter of 2018, rising by 187%. Ask yourself why all of a sudden it's surging by so much in this point in time. Based on what we just talked about, all of the concessions that Trump has given given Netanyahu. Basically saying you can do what you want and continuing to back them, even as they attack civilians, even as they launch illegal airstrikes, just anything they do goes as far as the United States is concerned. Now, according to the data, construction on 794 illegal settlement homes in Palestine's West Bank began between April and June of this year. A considerable jump compared to the 279 settlement homes that broke ground between January and March. And understand, these are settlements. These are kicking Palestinian people off of their land that they were already displaced from another location, saying you got to move again so we can make Jewish-only settlements. Just get up and move on. Think about what that means. Now, previously, Israeli right-wing nationalists, they're the most extreme in regard to what we're talking about, and settlers had actually worried that the actual construction of settlements had taken a downward turn, even though planning for settlement construction had increased sharply. However, the newly released statistics show that the jump in planned settlements is beginning to have a tangible effect in the occupied West Bank. You don't say. Very clearly changing. It's called ethnic cleansing. In addition to the major jump in new settlement construction, the completion of illegal settlements also rose in the second quarter of 2018, raising by 19% compared to the first quarter and resulting in a 66% increase compared to the second quarter of 2017. UN official Michael Link warned that, quote, after years of creeping Israel de facto annexation of large swaths of the West Bank through settlement expansion, the creation of closed military zones and other measures, Israel appears to be getting closer to enacting legislation that will formally annex parts of the West Bank. We already talked about the apartheid state law. This is just one step in a long process of ethnically cleansing what they think is their right. The Zionists. Not all the Jewish people, but the Zionist-controlled government. And many of the Jewish people that believe in that, which is ultimately a lie. It's a phantom. This is occupied Palestinian territory. And to further illustrate that point, here is literally the changing of how this has happened through the years. Actual Palestine, watching it disappear as it's illegally occupied by Israel. It's a horrifying thought to realize that this is what's happening. And understand this is actually happening not just by the support of the United States government or the willful ignorance of the United States government, but as we pointed out recently, your tax dollars. $10.5 million a day going to these families. $23,000 per Israeli family. Imagine what that could do for American families. Imagine what that could do for education, for infrastructure, for Flint's water. Imagine what that could do for so many things other than funding a terrorist state. Think about that. This is it truly is horrific to realize that this is what's happening today. But as I continue to point out on the show, it's increasingly paramount that we pay attention to what side we're being pushed onto. Because as Americans, we don't have to stand with this. If we live in this faux pretend democracy they claim we do, or rather claim it's real, but it's actually faux democracy, they claim we live in this democracy, we don't have to stand with this. This is our choice. Until they stand right up and say, guess what, we live in an authoritarian dictatorship, like it seems we do, then things might change. But at the moment, people need to stand up, speak out, and recognize what is happening right in front of you with your money. The genocide of an entire people. Really let that sink in. And understand as well that this is happening with the open support of the Trump administration. Widely, openly supported, as he pointed out the other day. Everything they can do to allow anything like this to go forward. Many of them openly acknowledged as Zionists themselves. Working for our government? Interesting. How they put Israel first. Doesn't sound like America first to me. So I want to end today with another video in relation to Yemen coming from Randy Nord from geopoliticsalert.com, a great website. If you're not familiar with it, I highly recommend you check it out. She recently spoke at the United Nations Human Rights Council, which is profound. It's a really big deal, and I want to play this video for you to end the show today. It's 6 minutes. Please stick around. Please watch it. She gives an entire speech about what's going on there in front of the United Nations. That is a very big deal, and she deserves our support. Because what's going on there, again, with our money being turned a blind eye to or actively participating in by our government, deserves your attention. Thank you for tuning in today. There will be no T-Lev Research and Review today. I'm sorry. I'm going to try to get some rest. I have an interview coming up with Vanessa Beeley tomorrow on the ground in Syria to discuss what's going on today. It should be about midday. You guys should see that tomorrow. So stay tuned. I love all of you. Make sure you check out the sources in the show notes below. And as always, question everything. Come to your own conclusions. Stay vigilant.
Since I'm born and raised in the United States, since its inception, the United States has portrayed itself as a defender of human rights at home and globally. But for over 3 years, the children of Yemen have had to experience firsthand the worst oppression the U.S. has to offer. According to the Legal Center for Rights and Development, by the war's 1,200th day, over 14,000 civilians were killed by coalition airstrikes. Of those civilian deaths, over 2,000 were women, while over 3,000 were children. And that's not including injuries or wounded. Vast majority of these lives cut short are not from ground fighting, but rather due to airstrikes from the coalition. The United States plays a key role facilitating the Saudi-led coalition's ability to carry out these airstrikes in several ways. According to Human Rights Watch, Washington approved more than $20 billion worth of military sales to Saudi Arabia in 2015 alone. 3 U.S. arms sales in 2015 and 2016, worth nearly $3 billion, involved replenishing Saudi weaponry specifically for their campaign in Yemen. According to the Center for International Policy, U.S. companies Raytheon, Lockheed Martin, Boeing, and General Dynamics were involved in 80 different deals with Saudi Arabia as of 2017. These deals included over 7,000 precision-guided missiles, 4,700 air-to-ground missiles, 7,800 general-purpose, 2,000-pound bombs, as well as countless attack helicopters and fighter jets to facilitate the bombings. Not only that, but the United States also provides refueling for fighter jets used to drop America's very own laser-guided munitions. One of the most horrendous attacks came last month when Saudi warplanes bombed a school bus full of children, killing dozens on board. Saudi officials initially defended the strike as a legitimate military action. Various outlets reported that the weapon used to strike the school bus was, in fact, a 227-kilogram laser-guided bomb made by U.S. manufacturer Lockheed Martin. The U.S. routinely skirts the blame for its own involvement in this violence against children. When Vox News asked a spokesperson for the U.S. Central Command whether or not a U.S. bomb was used in the school bus attack, Army Major Josh Jacques said, "We may never know if the munition was one that the United States sold to them." Estimates of the damage vary, but the International Committee of the Red Cross in Sada received the bodies of 29 children under the age of 15 and treated another 50, including 30 children. As for the refueling of warplanes in exchange in March between Army General Joseph Votel and the top U.S. military official for the Middle East and Senator Elizabeth Warren during a Senate Armed Services Committee hearing supports that. General, does the CENTCOM track the purposes of the munitions it is refueling? In other words, where a U.S. refueled aircraft is going, what targets it strikes, and the result of the mission? Senator, we do not. The Saudi coalition has also used internationally banned cluster munitions on at least 60 occasions, many of which are made in the U.S. According to the Legal Center for Rights and Development, 222 children casualties were documented due to cluster munitions. The bomb that destroyed a residential building in Yemen's capital in the summer of 2017, which killed 16 civilians and wounded 17 more, including 5-year-old Buthania, whose photograph went viral in the aftermath of the strike, was made in the U.S., according to Amnesty International. Amnesty's arms experts analyzed remnants of the weapons and indeed found it had clear markings matching U.S.-made components commonly used in laser-guided airdrop bombs. This particular airstrike hit several homes in Sana'a, severely damaging 3 of them and killing 7 children, including all 5 of Buthania's brothers and sisters. 8 other children sustained injuries, including a 2-year-old boy who lost both of his parents. In regards to the wedding massacre in April of 2018, a photograph shows remains of a wing assembly of an American-made GBU-12 Paveway 2 guided bomb, which resulted in 33 killed and 55 injured. More than 90 civilians, including 25 children, died in March of 2016. Saudi airstrike on a market. Months later, 10 more children perished in another strike at a school in Sada. The same day, 5 children were killed in a bomb smashed into a hospital in Hajjah. In regards to a Saudi coalition air raid on a funeral in 2016, high estimates suggest over 155 civilians were killed and over 500 others wounded. A UN report about that attack said the second airstrike, which occurred 3 to 8 minutes after the first airstrike, almost certainly resulted in more casualties to the already wounded and first responders. Human Rights Watch identified the munitions used in the airstrike as a 500-pound laser-guided bombs manufactured by the United States, called on Washington then to suspend arms sales to Saudi Arabia. Although it isn't certain the exact number of children killed in the wedding and funeral attacks, we can reasonably conclude that many children were present at these events, since they were purely civilian in nature, as are many other similar attacks on homes, markets, buses, schools, and so on and so forth. These figures are without even mentioning the countless attacks on schools, airports, seaports, and other institutions children rely on for life. In fact, the targeting of spaces where children are most likely to be present, such as in a home or school, have resulted in 4.5 million children not attending school. Rather than acting as a passive observer, this evidence makes it clear that the United States is complicit in these horrendous attacks on Yemen's children and continues to act without impunity unless something happens soon. Thank you.